January 1945, East Prussia. Senior Sergeant Vladimir Gelfand stood at the German border watching the first Soviet tanks cross into enemy territory. He had fought since 1943, survived Kursk and the liberation of Ukraine, witnessed the devastation Germans had left behind. Now, finally, they were taking the war to Germany itself. Around him, soldiers cheered. Officers made speeches about revenge. Everyone understood this moment's significance. After 3.5 years of brutal warfare, the Red Army was entering the Reich. 3 days later, Gelfand walked through his first German village. The experience left him deeply unsettled, though not in ways he'd expected. He had anticipated finding a nation militarized, impoverished, suffering under Nazi rule as Soviet propaganda claimed. What he found instead shocked him more than combat had. The houses had running water. The barns contained livestock, cows that produced more milk than he'd ever seen. The homes had furniture, real furniture, not the rough benches common in Russian villages. Even abandoned houses showed wealth beyond what most Soviet citizens possessed. That night, Gelfand wrote in his diary words that thousands of other Soviet soldiers were thinking but few would record. If they lived like this, why did they invade us? They had everything already. We have been told the German workers were oppressed, that they lived in poverty under fascism. But these villages, even the poor ones, are richer than anything in Russia. What were they fighting for? The question would haunt Soviet soldiers throughout their advance into Germany. They had expected to find tyranny and poverty. Instead, they discovered a standard of living so far above Soviet conditions that it challenged everything they believed about their own society. The encounter with German material prosperity, even in a nation being destroyed by war, forced a reckoning that Soviet authorities tried desperately to suppress. This is the story of what Soviet soldiers found when they entered Germany, and how that discovery shattered illusions about socialist superiority and German suffering. The confrontation wasn't just military. It was ideological, psychological, and ultimately transformative for hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops whose assumptions about their own society couldn't survive contact with German reality. To understand Soviet soldiers' reaction to Germany, you must understand what they were coming from. The Soviet Union in 1945 had endured nearly 4 years of total war that devastated everything. Over 25 million Soviet citizens had died. Entire cities had been destroyed. Industrial regions had been occupied and stripped. Agricultural areas had been fought over, leaving fields cratered and unusable. The Soviet economy, never prosperous even before the war, had been reduced to bare survival. Soviet soldiers came primarily from rural areas where pre-war living standards had been subsistence level. Most had grown up in villages without electricity, running water, or paved roads. Housing was typically single-room log cabins shared by extended families. Livestock ownership was collective, with individual families having access to animals but not owning them. Consumer goods were scarce even in peacetime and had virtually disappeared during the war. The propaganda soldiers received emphasized several themes that shaped their expectations of Germany. First, that Germans were suffering under fascist oppression, living in poverty while their leaders prepared for war. Second, that Germans who invaded the Soviet Union were motivated by desperation, seeking living space because their own nation couldn't support them. Third, that Soviet socialism was superior to capitalism or fascism in providing for people's needs. And fourth, that the war was fundamentally about defending this superior Soviet system against fascist barbarism. These narratives made sense to soldiers who had grown up in the Soviet system and knew nothing else. They explained why Germans would invade. They were desperate and oppressed. They explained why Soviets should fight to defend their superior society. They provided moral framework where Soviets were defenders of progress against reactionary fascism. The propaganda wasn't questioned because soldiers had no alternative information. The reality of German occupation of Soviet territory reinforced some elements of this propaganda while complicating others. German forces had committed systematic atrocities across occupied regions. Villages had been burned. Civilians had been murdered. Soviet POWs had been starved in camps where mortality exceeded 50%. The brutality was real and had affected virtually every Soviet soldier personally. They fought with genuine hatred for an enemy who had destroyed their homeland. But the atrocities created cognitive dissonance with the poverty narrative. If Germans were desperate and impoverished, why did they waste resources on mass murder? Why implement systematic policies of starvation and destruction rather than simply occupying territory? The contradiction wasn't obvious to most soldiers, but it existed beneath the surface, waiting for some trigger to bring it into consciousness. The trigger was crossing into Germany and seeing firsthand how Germans actually lived. The first encounters occurred in January 1945 as Soviet forces pushed into East Prussia. The region was technically German territory, though it had been separated from the Reich proper since World War I. It was also rural and had been somewhat isolated from Central German industrialization. If anywhere in Germany should have shown poverty, East Prussia would have been it. What Soviet soldiers found instead astonished them. Lev Koplev, a Soviet officer and writer, described entering German villages. "We were shocked by what we saw. Houses with multiple rooms, one family per house. This alone was unimaginable luxury to us. Furniture in every room, real beds with mattresses, kitchens with running water, indoor plumbing, barns with well-fed animals, orchards, gardens. These were supposedly poor German farmers, but they lived better than our collective farm chairmen." The material disparity wasn't subtle. Things Soviet citizens considered luxuries available only to party elite were common in German working-class homes. Bicycles, which were rare in the Soviet Union, seemed universal in Germany. Sewing machines, radios, furniture, items most Soviet families couldn't afford, appeared in virtually every German home. Even abandoned houses contained possessions that would have represented wealth in Soviet terms. The agricultural comparison was particularly striking. Soviet soldiers, many from collective farms, understood agriculture intimately. German farms, even in war-ravaged East Prussia, showed productivity Soviet collective farms never achieved. The livestock were healthier. The tools were better maintained. The storage barns contained reserves that Soviet farms never accumulated. The infrastructure, roads, fencing, irrigation, was superior. Everything suggested German farmers produced more efficiently and lived far better than their Soviet counterparts. The questions this raised were dangerous from the Soviet perspective. If Germans lived so much better than Soviets under capitalism and fascism, what did that say about Soviet socialism? If the enemy's standard of living exceeded the Soviet Union's, how could the Soviet system claim superiority? These weren't abstract political questions. They were immediate, visceral comparisons based on direct observation that contradicted decades of propaganda. Vladimir Gelfand's diary captured the psychological disruption. "We have been told all our lives that we are building the most advanced society in the world, that Soviet workers live better than workers anywhere, that capitalism means poverty for everyone except a few capitalists. But here in Germany, even during wartime, even after bombing, the standard of living is obviously higher than in the Soviet Union. How can this be?" The cognitive dissonance created different responses among different soldiers. Some rationalized the disparity by attributing German prosperity to exploitation of occupied territories. Germans were wealthy because they had plundered the rest of Europe, a narrative that had some truth but didn't fully explain pre-war German prosperity. Some decided that Germans must have suffered more than was visible, that the wealth was facade hiding oppression. Some simply stopped thinking about the contradiction, focusing on immediate military tasks rather than uncomfortable questions. But for many, particularly educated soldiers and officers, the encounter with German living standards was intellectually devastating. Everything they had believed about Soviet superiority was challenged by obvious material evidence. The propaganda that had sustained them, couldn't survive contact with German reality. The ideological certainty that had justified war's sacrifices dissolved in recognition that they were fighting to defend a system materially inferior to what they were destroying. The revenge that Soviet forces took on Germany must be understood partially in this context. The atrocities, rape, murder, looting, had multiple causes. Hatred for German crimes in the Soviet Union was primary. Breakdown of military discipline as the war ended was significant. Alcohol consumption was endemic, but some of the violence also reflected rage at being deceived. Soviet soldiers who discovered they were materially worse off than the enemy they were defeating felt betrayed by their own government's lies. The looting was particularly revealing. Soviet soldiers sent enormous quantities of goods back to the Soviet Union: bicycles, watches, sewing machines, furniture, anything portable that represented wealth unattainable at home. The scale of looting suggested it wasn't just opportunistic theft, but attempt to claim material goods that Soviet propaganda had promised but never delivered. Officers participated as enthusiastically as enlisted men, revealing that the desire for consumer goods transcended rank. Soviet authorities understood the danger. Orders were issued forbidding soldiers from writing home about German living standards. Censors were instructed to confiscate letters that mentioned the material disparity. Political officers were tasked with explaining away the contradictions, attributing German prosperity to temporary factors that would disappear with Nazi defeat. But controlling information among hundreds of thousands of soldiers spread across occupied Germany was impossible. The response from home complicated matters further. Soviet civilians receiving letters and packages from Germany were equally shocked by what soldiers described and sent. Families who had never seen certain consumer goods suddenly received them from relatives serving in Germany. The material gap between Soviet and German living standards became apparent to millions of Soviet citizens through the occupation, creating questions that authorities couldn't fully suppress. Alexander Solzhenitsyn, serving as artillery officer during the advance into Germany, later wrote about the psychological impact. For the politically aware among us, Germany was a revelation of our own misery. We saw that even in defeat, even after years of war, Germans lived better than we did in victory. This knowledge was suppressed, forbidden, but it couldn't be forgotten. We brought back not just loot but understanding that we had been systematically lied to about the outside world. The encounter wasn't just with material goods but with infrastructure. Soviet soldiers saw paved roads in rural areas, something rare in the Soviet Union. They saw railway systems more extensive than Soviet networks despite Germany being far smaller. They saw electrical grids that reached rural villages, while most Soviet villages lacked electricity. The infrastructure gap revealed developmental disparities that couldn't be explained by Nazi exploitation or war preparation. The urban experience was even more dramatic. When Soviet forces reached major German cities, Königsberg, Danzig, later Berlin, soldiers encountered urban development beyond their experience. Buildings with elevators, underground railways, street lighting, sewage systems, parks, public amenities. Even bombed-out German cities showed evidence of prosperity and organization that Soviet cities couldn't match. The comparison was devastating to narratives of Soviet superiority. German POWs complicated the narrative further. Soviet propaganda had portrayed German soldiers as fanatical Nazis who believed in racial superiority and worshipped Hitler. Many German prisoners turned out to be ordinary men conscripted into military service, who expressed relief at capture and had little enthusiasm for Nazi ideology. They weren't the monsters propaganda depicted, but rather people uncomfortably similar to Soviet soldiers themselves, except better equipped and from more prosperous backgrounds. The female Soviet soldiers and medics who entered Germany faced particular psychological burden. Soviet propaganda had emphasized women's emancipation under socialism as proof of Soviet superiority. But German women, even in war-ravaged conditions, often appeared healthier, better dressed, and better housed than their Soviet counterparts. The supposed advantages of Soviet women's liberation seemed questionable when German women in a fascist society had enjoyed higher material standards. The educational disparity was noted by some observers. German civilians, even working class, typically had completed more years of schooling than Soviet equivalents. Literacy rates were higher. Technical skills were more widespread. This suggested that Nazi Germany, despite propaganda about fascist oppression, had developed human capital more effectively than Soviet socialism. For ideologically committed Soviet soldiers, this was another uncomfortable reality. The mechanization gap was impossible to ignore. German farms, despite wartime losses of tractors and machinery, showed evidence of mechanization far beyond Soviet agriculture. German industry, even in ruins, revealed technological sophistication exceeding Soviet capabilities. The equipment captured from German forces was often superior to Soviet equivalents. The technological backwardness of the Soviet Union relative to Germany became apparent through direct comparison. Some soldiers responded to these discoveries by doubling down on ideology. They attributed everything to German theft from occupied territories, Nazi exploitation of workers, or temporary advantages that would disappear. They rejected evidence conflicting with propaganda through selective perception that preserved their worldview. For these soldiers, the encounter with Germany reinforced hatred without challenging beliefs, but they were probably the minority. More common was selective acknowledgement. Soldiers admitted Germans lived better materially, but attributed this to factors that didn't challenge Soviet legitimacy. Germans were better off because they hadn't suffered revolution and civil war, or because they had industrialized earlier, or because they exploited colonies. These explanations allowed soldiers to recognize reality while maintaining belief in Soviet systems' ultimate superiority. It was cognitive compromise that preserved psychological stability. But for some, the encounter was radically transformative. They recognized that Soviet propaganda had systematically lied about the outside world. If the lies about German poverty were false, what else was false? These soldiers returned to the Soviet Union with questions they couldn't ask publicly but couldn't ignore privately. They became nuclei of dissent, quietly skeptical of propaganda, privately critical of the system. Some would become dissidents in later years. The Soviet government's response was to suppress discussion of German living standards while accelerating looting. Official policy encouraged soldiers to send home goods from Germany, both to reward service and to prevent soldiers from keeping evidence of German prosperity. The massive transfer of equipment, goods, and reparations from Germany to the Soviet Union was partly economic recovery, but also partly attempt to satisfy Soviet population's material desires without reforming the economic system. The dismantling of German industry and its transport to the Soviet Union served multiple purposes. It weakened Germany, compensated for Soviet losses, and provided Soviet citizens with material goods that the Soviet economy hadn't produced. Entire factories were disassembled and shipped east. Railways were torn up for scrap. Housing was stripped of fixtures and materials. The looting was systematic and massive, reaching scale that suggested Soviet authorities understood how desperate Soviet material situation had become. The longer Soviet forces remained in Germany, the more uncomfortable the comparisons became. Occupation troops stationed in East Germany lived better than they had in the Soviet Union, even in occupation conditions. They had access to goods unavailable at home. Their families received packages that elevated their living standards. The disparity created resentment among troops, rotated home, and incentivized soldiers to extend occupation service. The problem was significant enough that authorities eventually limited occupation tour lengths. The fate of German civilians under Soviet occupation must be understood partially as response to the prosperity Soviet soldiers discovered. The looting, the factory dismantlement, the systematic stripping of resources reflected not just revenge for German crimes, but also desire to claim material goods that Soviet citizens lacked. The brutality had many causes, but material envy was certainly one of them. Soviet soldiers took from Germans what Soviet system hadn't provided them. The long-term impact on Soviet society was subtle but real. Hundreds of thousands of Soviet soldiers returned home having seen that the outside world, even enemy fascist nation in defeat, lived better than they did in victory. This knowledge couldn't be eliminated through censorship or propaganda. It existed in private conversations, family stories, personal memories. It created population segment that understood Soviet propaganda was false because they had seen alternatives directly. This contributed to the gradual loss of ideological certainty that would eventually undermine Soviet system. The generation that fought in World War II and saw Germany couldn't believe propaganda as uncritically as previous generations. They passed skepticism to their children, who passed it to their children. The encounter with German prosperity planted seeds of doubt that would germinate over decades, contributing to eventual Soviet collapse when younger generations rejected the system their grandparents had fought to defend. For individual soldiers, processing the experience varied. Vladimir Gelfand, whose diary documented his discoveries in Germany, returned to the Soviet Union and lived quietly, never publishing his observations during his lifetime. His diary was only published decades after his death, revealing thoughts he couldn't express publicly. Lev Koplev, the officer who described German prosperity, became dissident and was eventually expelled from the Soviet Union. Alexander Solzhenitsyn spent years in the Gulag, partly for letters critical of Soviet system written during the German campaign. The pattern was clear. Honest discussion of what Soviet soldiers found in Germany was dangerous. The disparity between propaganda and reality had to be suppressed because acknowledging it would undermine the entire ideological foundation of Soviet system. If Germans under fascism lived better than Soviets under socialism, what justified Soviet system's existence? The question couldn't be allowed, so the observations that prompted it had to be silenced. But silencing was incomplete. Too many soldiers had seen Germany. Too many families had received letters and packages. Too many people knew the truth for suppression to be total. The knowledge persisted beneath surface of official propaganda, creating cognitive dissonance that affected Soviet society for generations. The encounter with German prosperity was suppressed but not forgotten, and it contributed to gradual erosion of belief in Soviet superiority that would eventually prove fatal to the system. The story of Soviet soldiers entering Germany is typically told as story of revenge and atrocities. Those elements were real and devastating, but underneath was another story, equally important. The discovery by Soviet soldiers that their enemy lived better than they did, that their society's claims of superiority were false, and that they had sacrificed enormously to defend a system that couldn't provide material prosperity comparable to the fascist enemy they had defeated. This discovery challenged everything they had believed and forced reckoning with uncomfortable truths about their own society. When Senior Sergeant Vladimir Gelfand stood at the German border in January 1945, he expected to find oppression and poverty. What he found instead was prosperity that exposed Soviet backwardness and propaganda's falseness. The discovery changed him, as it changed hundreds of thousands of other Soviet soldiers. They had won the war militarily, but lost the ideological certainty that had sustained them through it. The victory was complete on the battlefield, but hollow in its confrontation with the reality that Soviet system was materially inferior to what it had defeated. That uncomfortable truth would haunt Soviet society until the system finally collapsed decades later.